Okay, hi Year 12 students. We're about to move into Station 11, Section 5, entitled Toronto. And this section is mostly the story of Jeevan and Frank, and set mostly just during the pandemic and unfolding. But it starts with chapter 27 and it's 7 years before the end of the world. I did comment on this opening paragraph. I thought was really interesting. There was a moment on Earth, improbable in retrospect, and actually briefer than a moment in the span of human history, more like the blink of an eye, when it was possible to make a living solely by photographing and interviewing famous people. I just loved the expression there. I thought there was such a sense of whimsy in the fact that it was like a blink of an eye in the scope of human history, but it's almost like it's unbelievable that somebody could make a living by photographing and interviewing famous people, revealing the unbelievable nature of this need for celebrity gossip that we have in our modern society. And so 7 years before the end of the world, actually, Jeevan is about to interview Arthur Leander. He's been working as a paparazzo, doing okay, but he's sick of stalking celebrities. I like this bit. He was trying to become an entertainment journalist, which was sleazy, but less sleazy than his current job being a paparazzo. And we see Mandel's views and values about the paparazzo and entertainment journalists clearly expressed here. He fears Arthur would remember him from their history in the past, but as he has this 15-minute interview, Arthur sort of goes silent and then asks Jeevan a question. How does a person become an entertainment journalist? And then they have this conversation. It's a conversation about life. They talk about Arthur's shock, I guess, at what he's seen paparazzi do, climbing trees to get a photo of him washing dishes. And these extreme actions of the paparazzi are similarly condemned by Mandel and Arthur himself. This irony as he's actually speaking to a paparazzi, but he doesn't know that Jeevan is one. And they're having this interesting conversation about the meaning of life. And I've just noted that it's this seeming moment of honest connection between Jeevan and Arthur, but it's followed by a moment where Arthur discloses something incredibly private. So the meaning of life discussion, and then Arthur says, if I tell you something, will you keep it secret? Something no one else knows, but 24 hours you have to hold it. And Jeevan says, I'm a man of my word. It's interesting that at that point in his directionless life, he actually wasn't sure if this was true or not, but it was nice to think that it might be. It's an aspirational thought, but it eventually does become true. Jeevan does become a man of honor, a man of integrity, as we see in later chapters. And perhaps I have noted that perhaps this indicates Mandel's belief that people are capable of change and people are capable of becoming more noble, becoming more benevolent, and perhaps those defining moments, perhaps tragedy can be the trigger to make sure this take place, as in the case of Jeevan. Anyway, then Arthur discloses that he's leaving his wife, Elizabeth, for Lydia Mark's wife, who's going to become wife number 3. And he has to because he's in love with somebody else. And I just noticed the callousness of this action of this public way of disclosing the most private moment and grief of a little breakdown of a relationship. He's pretty much forcing himself to tell her by making it public. So now he forces his hand. He actually has to tell her, but he is not going to give her very much time to react before it becomes public. And I've just made a comment that Arthur definitely seems like quite a bad guy here. But he's quite complicated. He's not black or white. He's shades of grey. I do want you to think about, why is he presented like a bad guy? What part of him would be callous, careless, selfish, but what parts of him would not be? And perhaps really in your evaluation of Arthur, you need to explore the multifaceted aspects of his character. Interestingly, he actually Arthur does to Elizabeth what he did to Miranda. And the way that Jeevan kind of prepares to present the split, it was mutual and amicable, considerable respect for one another, decided mutually to go their separate ways. All of these, this almost perfect presentation of their split, condensed, sanitized, a clean and acceptable version which is told to the public, represents how people can try and neaten things up and make ourselves present well instead of actually being real and honest about the truth. And then we've got chapter 8. Okay. And then we've got chapter 28. In chapter 28, it's 8 days post-pandemic, during the pandemic outbreak, basically. So Jeevan is in Frank's apartment and he's remembering the flashback of, so this is like the segue, he's actually remembering this interview and this moment with Arthur that, excuse me. Then, 29, Jeevan declares that he's proud. One of the very few moments he was proud of in his professional life is that he had told nobody about Arthur and Elizabeth's split for 24 hours. He kept this secret. And it's interesting because here we have a juxtaposition of two actions of Jeevan. He is the holding on to the secret, and it's the tricking Arthur's first wife, Miranda, into an unflattering photograph. These two moments are juxtaposed. The good and the bad. Human beings are capable of both good and evil acts. We're capable of acts of incredible self-sacrifice, benevolence, alongside acts of selfishness and harm. And I think that Mandel is presenting both of these beside each other, and later the fact that Jeevan does much good, to reinforce what I've just referred to, that idea that individuals can develop strength and character as a result of adversity. Chapter 30, I've put a little video here for you to watch. It's the End of the World theme song. Last year, when we were in the middle of lockdown, our third wave, second wave, whatever it was for Melbourne, the second lockdown, 2.0, I sang this song on repeat, and so I got a big kick out of reading it here. It's the end of the world as they know it. It's like an earworm that's got in Jeevan's head. There's some really graphic descriptions in these next coming chapters of survival post-pandemic and how the people who survived, what they had to do in order to survive. So Jeevan taped plastic over the air ducts. There's danger from the people. So they put bath towels over the windows to prevent stray light from escaping at night, alluding to the fact that if people saw the lights, then they would be in danger. Then we get more information there by people knocking on their door and trying to break in, and Jeevan and Frank waiting in an agony of stillness as these people tried to get in. They felt like everybody was to be feared, and I think the metaphor that's used here is that it's a horror movie that wouldn't end. And I think that's quite powerful there. There's some descriptions of the first couple of days, people trying to exit the city, then gridlock, and then people walking. And then in day 5, Frank is working on his ghostwriting project instead of watching the news. There's a connection to the fact that the news was going to drive them both crazy. Quite a nice quote in there. And there's a description of the channels and the news channels going offline one by one until everyone had left, and he's just staring at the empty room and the screen, the news screens. And then the internet blanked out. And then there's this great section here. It's page 177 down the bottom, where Toronto is falling silent. Every morning, the quiet was deeper, the perpetual hum of the city fading away. And I noticed there the reference to the epigraph where it talks about the light of the city turning off. But despite that, Frank never stopped working, which is just below. First time through, I just wrote why. Second time through, I'm thinking, okay, so Frank's work, is he working out of honour? And the next page, it's like, well, he signed a contract. Or is he working out of a way of staying sane? Or is he perhaps having a greater sense of purpose? Mandel exploring the fact that some things and some jobs, some ways of occupying our time have purpose in and of itself. Even though he recognises the philanthropist he writes about is likely dead, Frank certainly has a sense of accomplishment and leaves it as his final. Later on, you'll see he actually leaves it on his desk just before he commits suicide. So there's clearly a sense of accomplishment in the work, even though it's not going to be read by anybody. That there's a value he places in the work. So I think that's something worth considering and tossing around for you as well. Jeevan thinks about the fact that the city is quite human, that we think about it as impersonal, but actually there's this massive, delicate infrastructure of people. And when people stop going to work, everything stops. And all of these things that stop working after the pandemic is because of the interconnectivity of our lives, how we all depend on each other. And then when human beings stop doing the actions required, actually civilization breaks down. And so there's the end of running water, the end of electricity, the end of running water. But there's a great section at the top of 179 here where it says Jeevan had never felt so close to his brother. And I thought that was worth noticing, that despite this tragedy, there is intense value in human connection, relationships, and a family. And Jeevan has this optimism that we'll just stay here till the lights come back on or till the Red Cross shows up, and he's imagining a soldier offering him a cup of coffee once they're rescued. He's imagining being saved, like a movie, I guess. But Frank's the voice of realism here, saying, well, what makes you think these lights will come back on? And it's the end of the chapter. And then we start a section where we jump in between the interviews with Kirsten and the pandemic, during pandemic Frank and Jeevan scenes. So 31, there's a bunch of the interviews just continuing between Diallo and Raymond, and she talks about remembering the day 1 when Arthur actually died of a heart attack, and there was this guy, a mystery audience member who knew CPR. And this is kind of like a dramatic irony, which is when the audience, in this case the reader, us, we know that this unknown man is actually Jeevan, who we're reading about in the chapters around here. So I think this dramatic irony represents this both randomness of the relationships, interconnections, and also the deep interconnectedness of life and relationships, and the fact that our actions actually will impact others, like a ripple effect or a flow-on effect. And chapter 32, it's day 47, post-pandemic, during the pandemic, and the danger and the horrors of the world immediately upon or during the pandemic is really reinforced here. There's the visual imagery of smoke rising in the distance. There's gunshots being heard. There's the stench of death that is in the house despite the plastic duct tape and the towels. They're running out of food. There's enough for another 2 weeks. Jeevan's imagining how he's going to get Frank out of there. Jeevan goes on a little explore, and there's a conversation where Frank and Jeevan are planning, and Jeevan says the bottom of 183 here. Jeevan says, there's a world still out there outside this apartment. And in this case, a world kind of represents a fullness of life, because Frank says, I think there's just survival out there. I think you should go and try to survive. Referencing that idea of survival versus a fulfilled, meaningful life. The quote, survival is insufficient, being a major theme in the novel that we see. Frank says, I'll leave first. I've given this some thought. A sacrifice to make sure that Jeevan can survive. But also here, there's a section where he talks about after he's shot, they said I wouldn't walk again. And I spent a long time thinking about civilization, what it means and what I value. And I remember thinking, I never want to see a war zone again as long as I live. I still don't. This horror of war being emphasized here, but also the freedom of choice, of his choice to, I never want to see a war zone again. I would rather die. And I think Mandel is certainly critical of war and those who harm others, but also advocating this freedom and autonomy of choice. Frank's actions is seen as honourable, noble, and like he has the right to choose. If he doesn't want to see this war zone again, he shouldn't have to. I feel like there's an implied human value that you could analyse there. 33, back to the interview with Raymond and Diallo. She references the paperweight and explains that although it's unusual, she thought it was beautiful and she still does. She talks about waiting there and her parents disappearing, her never seeing them again. But Peter, her brother, actually comes and finds her. And then we're back to 34, which is Jeevan and Frank. So we're alternating here. And Jeevan, this is an interesting chapter here where Jeevan, they haven't spoken for 2 days, and Jeevan says, read me something. And so Frank reads from the manuscript that he's writing, which is an overprivileged philanthropist's thoughts. Philanthropy is doing good. So a philanthropist is somebody that does good, and particularly referring to charitable work and contributing money to charities. And so it's worth looking at these comments that he reads. I think there's some really strong views and values there that you can analyse. Authorial intent here about how people are remembered, and this concept of immortality, that people want to be remembered after their death, and how people are remembering. They want to be famous. They want to be seen. It kind of says, well, people don't really go into entertainment to do good in the world. They go into entertainment because they want to be famous, but then they're doing good. They set up charitable organizations, but actually they're not really motivated by doing good. It makes me think of Immanuel Kant and some of the things that he says. He's a philosopher who talks about if your intention is not good, then the action is also not good. And I think Mandel is critical of people's selfish motivations, even when doing good. And so I think that's just me, whether or not you see that or you want to talk about it. And also, don't forget here at the bottom, there is certainly that idea about how people long to leave a legacy, and in that way they become immortal. Chapter 35, back to the interview and the horrors of that post-pandemic world where they just had to walk. 36, Jeevan is now on his own, which means that Frank is passed. There's a description of him and this vertiginous giving way, a cliff crumbling beneath his feet when he goes and checks on Frank, because how horrible it would be if he woke up and he was alone. Obviously, that's not a real cliff crumbling. It's a metaphorical description to represent the grief and pain of losing his brother, who he's felt closest to than he's ever had in his life. Metaphorical description of the grief here. And Frank's death, so this is where he leaves the manuscript on the desk, and he's written, I've been thinking about immortality and how people are remembered. Jeevan packs up his bag, he's got this backpack, and he leaves. The danger of the world is reinforced through the imagery of the smoke again, the absence of light. Remember that we can analyze light, hope, civilization, and Frank's death from pills is again explained. 191, the danger of gunshots, and there's this random section here in 191. It'll be really interesting to have a look at here. Jeevan is like just thinking, and as he's thinking, he's remembering like some things from their childhood with Frank and ice cream and stirring in the vanilla, making ice cream. And then he remembers Frank standing with his pre-Libya legs, so the legs that he could stand on before he got shot. And then he then he thinks of or imagines a woman giving birth to a child who will someday pull the trigger on a gun. And then he imagines a designer sketching the weapon and a dictator making a decision, and all of these factors that have to line up into place to actually result in Frank being shot. So there's a few things that he thinks about in random succession, reinforcing the interconnectedness again, the ripple effect, the impact of one decision on the people and the world around us. Okay, random, but I think powerful if you wanted to use it in an essay of some kind. And then as we come through, he's alone for 5 days walking, and the Georgia flu was so efficient that there was almost no one left. And he thought and imagined that it would be a lawless world, but instead it was an empty one, and this emptiness began to sink in. And then he sees other survivors, these 3 people. There's a connection, a conversation with them. They realize that some of them might be immune, because Ben actually looked after his family but never got sick. Then they separate after a week, and there's an interesting interaction here at the bottom, I think, of 193, where Jeevan reflects that Frank was so goddamn calm about anything, which kind of mirrors Kirsten's comments about Jeevan being calm, when she reflects in the interview that the guy who gave her who did CPR and sat with her afterwards was calm. But we know as a reader that outwardly Jeevan was calm, but perhaps not inwardly. Anyway, the terrible actions are during post-pandemic are explained in this bottom of 193 as well. We have people getting killed for the contents of their backpacks, hungry dogs, gunshots in towns, and he's like reinforcing his sense of identity, holding on to his sense of identity through, I was a photographer, I was going to be a pandemic, my parents are George of Ottawa and Amala of Hyderabad, I was born in the Toronto suburbs. He's actually like declaring, and the power of declaration here is declaring who he is. He's declaring his identity, his sense of self, so that he doesn't forget. And the power of that we see as he actually becomes a character of worth later on. 37, we're back to the interview, and it's clear that Kirsten has blocked out this year immediately post-pandemic when she was walking, because the shock is considerable. But once they actually stopped in a town and she stopped walking, she remembers everything after that. And then she says that, actually it's probably easier for kids than it was for adults. And the kids seemed awfully traumatized, remarks Diallo, and Kirsten says, well, sure, yeah, but a couple of years later, she actually can't remember the time that she spent on the road. She can't remember the worst of it. People who have the hardest time in this current era, whatever you want to call it, the world after the Georgia flu, doesn't seem like the people who struggle the most with it are the people who remember the old world clearly. And again, this theme of the memory of the former world that causes struggles is reinforced again here. And my questions to you was that what is the value of preserving this old world? The Museum of Civilization is a powerful motif, a powerful symbol of preserving the old world, which Mandel clearly values. She has Clark, a character that she presents honorably, holding on to these things. However, there's some of the things that of the modern world, the pre-pandemic world, she clearly disapproves of. So what is she actually saying people should hold on to? What is she saying people shouldn't? What's the value of holding on to the old world? What things of value from the old world should be held on to, and what should be lost? They're my questions to you as we close this section. So that's the end of section 5, Toronto.